Welcome back to Monday Mod Tips. Today we're going to be disassembling and reassembling a rival Kronos. I will show you how to take it all the way apart, how all of the locks and so forth work, what things can be removed and what effect they will have, and then I will show you how to properly reassemble it. First, we're going to go over the external controls. So there is a safety, which is simply a mechanical safety that prevents you from pulling the trigger. It's very straightforward. Now I can pull the trigger. There are also two separate locks on the slide. So when you pull the slide back partially, it will lock in place, and you cannot push it back forward. At this point, it isn't open enough for you to load. Once you go back a little bit further, it locks again. It's still not quite all the way primed, and it isn't all the way loaded, but again, you can't move the slide forward. Once you go all the way back, the bolt opens up all the way, the breech opens up all the way, and you can now load rounds in, and you can now slide it forward. But once you start sliding it forward, you now can't pull it back anymore. So once you've gone this far, you can't re-prime. You have to go all the way. It will then lock all the way forward, and now it is completely locked until you pull the trigger. Now it then releases. Again, partial trigger pull will lock it in that position, or partial prime will lock it in that position. You'll also notice that now the trigger is locked, and you cannot pull the trigger even though the safety is not engaged. You cannot pull the trigger while the slide is back. Once you prime it fully, again, you can't re-prime it. However, there is a tab here on the back, this little button. If you pull that down, it will then allow you to re-prime the blaster. That is in case, say, a round didn't get all the way into battery and got pinched and everything, it got all locked up, but isn't actually firing, isn't actually properly in battery. You can open that up in order to clear jams and whatnot. Alright, let's get this thing open. We will start on the painted side. There is one screw on this side, and it is one of two fairly unique screws. They're shorter, they are of a countersunk design so that they sit flush with the blaster on the outside. There is a second one here. Take those two out. There are three other unusually sized screws. The two here in the base of the handle are longer screws, but they are your standard Nerf shell screw. They're just a little bit longer. We will take them out first. There is one shorter screw up here in the rear rail. It's just, again, standard Nerf shell screw, but it is a little bit shorter. All of the rest of the screws in the shell are exactly the same, and so it doesn't matter where they go. Those five are just the ones that you need to worry about. If we take the two screws out of the slide, there is then a screw port hidden underneath there. Be aware of that. Train. All the rest of these are standard. Now, the very first time you go to open up a blaster, I already got those ones. The very first time, the screws will be quite tight because they were actually, I assume they actually tap the thread in the plastic with the screw as they are installed. And so they actually get quite a good seal. So you're going to want to apply plenty of pressure and give it a good sharp twist to pop loose. And you'll generally hear it pop as it comes loose of the plastic. Once it gets going, it should be fairly simple to remove, and once you've removed it more than once, they get easier and easier. Okay. Now, for keeping track of where screws go, you can either, if you have the original instructions, you can stick them through the instructions where they roughly exist. If you don't, you can just use a regular piece of paper and draw out the outline and stick the screws in where it goes. Or if you have a really neat magnet plate, you can just put them on the magnet plate where they are. I've got to get myself one of those. Somebody mentioned it in the comments last time, and it was a really good idea. Alright. Now, you're going to want to be careful, as I was not, because there is a fair amount of pre-compression in this blaster, and it will cause the back end to pop loose, which is why people often, it springs, and then they're not able to figure out how everything goes back together. Thus, the point of this video. So we are going to remove the main spring and put everything back in so that I can cycle the blaster, cycle the action, and show you how everything works. Alright, everything is now in place, and there are, as I said, essentially three locks. There is a slide lock here, there is a side lock in the back, and there is a trigger lock. There is also, if you want to get technical, the safety, which is also really a form of a lock, but it is simply a mechanical, pulls down, and this little notch, or this little post, engages with the back of the trigger here, and prevents it from being pulled when the lock is in position. You can just take that screw out and remove the lock, or that if you don't want it, but that should be its natural position. So, let's take a look at what's going on in here. I'm going to take a look at the front two, the first side lock and the trigger lock first. So let's zoom in. Both of these are engaged as you prime the blaster and the plunger tube moves back. These will both be engaged. So as we start moving back, you can see that this rotates and then locks into place. And as that moved back, the trigger lock also engaged. So we can no longer pull the trigger, and because of this, we can no longer move this forward. As it moves even further back, it will engage again, as you can see there. It's popped into another notch, and again is preventing the bolt from being moved forward, from the slide from being moved forward. When it goes just a little bit further, I'll try to make sure my hands are out of the way here. Let's try this again. There we go. It now returns to its resting straight up position. Now, when it starts moving forward, it rotates the other direction and again locks on one of those notches, and now we can't move the slide back. There's another one. Again, cannot move the slide back because it is in position. And then once we go all the way forward, it pops up again and is now in the upright position, so it can go the other way. And our trigger lock has been released, and we are now able to move our trigger. So that is how both of those work. Now let's take a look at the lock in the back. And first we will need to deprime the blaster. So you can see these two parts are, the hooks are not currently engaged. They're just barely able to slide past each other. When we prime the blaster and the plunger rod comes out the back, it pushes this part up. And now when we force everything forward, you can see that these two have now hooked. They are now engaged, and they will prevent you from being able to pull the slide back. But this little button is connected there, and that is what allows you to manually release that slide lock. If you pull this up, you can then pull the slide back. Alternatively, if you removed one or either of these parts, that slide lock would then be completely disabled and would no longer function at all. If you remove one of those or both of those in conjunction with removing the trigger lock, you will then be able to deprime the blaster. You'll be able to pull the slide back, pull the trigger, slide it forward again, and deprime the blaster. It would also allow you to load multiple rounds at once. So if you wanted to be able to load, say, 2 rounds in a shotgun configuration, if you had a heavy enough spring to do that, that is what you would need to do. There really isn't a good reason to remove this, other than that it can be slightly annoying to reinstall, but it prevents you from doing a partial load or various other things. So it makes sure that you prime the blaster all the way and make sure that it has actually caught. So that is fairly useful, but it can be removed without preventing the blaster from operating correctly. So let's get to full disassembly. I am going to start by taking out the catch assembly. Well, actually, first I will need to release it. So I'll start by taking out the catch assembly, as well as the plunger tube. Now, what is neat about this particular blaster is that you can, in fact, prime it outside of the blaster, and that is important. We will be using that fact later on, but you can, in fact, do that, and it is very useful. We then can remove one of the parts of the slide lock. I'll slide this back a little bit. We've got this part, which has a spring that sits on it there. We can then take out these two plates. They just slide over each other, and they exist to cover up the gap on the underside of the slide to prevent junk and grit and Lego or whatever from getting in the back of your blaster and jamming at wood chips and whatnot. Those just come out. You can then take this lock off and remove it if you want. It just is a leaf spring. And I don't have too much of a problem with it being a leaf spring because it's not one that's going to get used a whole lot. It generally just stays in that position, and it just needs to go up a little bit in order to catch and to have a little bit of spring if you want to manually release it. So I don't hold too much of a grudge for that one being a leaf spring. This one, which is the more important one, has a proper spring, so I'm okay with that. But we can remove both of those if we want and remove the whole slide. Going forward, we can take out the trigger. It does have a proper spring. It's got, the notches need to go up so that they can gauge in the proper positions. We can then remove our trigger lock, which also has a plastic leaf spring. But again, it's not one that gets engaged a whole lot. It only actually engages when the slide is in the back position, so it's not likely to wear out too quickly. We can then remove our slide lock, and this is probably the part that gives people the most grief. And we will discuss how that gets reinstalled in the proper position when we go to reassembly. We then have our plunger barrel magazine assembly, which is all one big kind of conglomeration. The front plastic barrel part just comes off. You can then pull the barrel out. It has an O-ring that you will occasionally want to relubricate probably, and then it also has the hop-up tab. And if you're going to modify this to have a much heavier spring and you're getting 120, 125 FPS, you're going to want to either remove or reduce the hop-up, or the hop-up will be too much and you won't be able to hit anything at all. The plunger tube can simply be pulled off the back and doesn't have anything in it. Nothing weird, no extra parts, no moving parts in there. Then we have the magazine and AR assembly. And here is something that you may want to modify, is the follower. Because with minor modifications to the follower, you can in fact make it hold a 6th round. And some people like doing that. There are also replacement, both front ends and followers that allow for that as well. A little bit cleaner and a little bit better fit. You can, if you want, remove the AR simply by removing that screw right there. The AR will then simply drop out. I don't recommend it. It doesn't give you much of a power boost, but it will reduce the life of your blaster because dry firing is bad. Rival is a little bit stouter in that regard, but it's still, I don't feel that it's really worth the wear and tear, for my personal opinion. We then do have top rail that can be removed. We do have the sling mount that could be removed if you wanted to. I'm going to leave it on there. We do have the jam door, which a lot of people will simply remove entirely because it really just gets in the way for reloading, or they'll replace it with one that has a hole or has a socket for a speed loader, which is really, really cool. And then the final part is this goofy looking thing. It's another leaf spring, and it is the catch for the jam door. And if you're removing the jam door, then you obviously don't need that part. If you're going to replace the jam door, you still do. Again, not one where it being a leaf spring bothers me because it doesn't get a whole lot of use. It's really always in the one position. It just has enough tension to hold it in that position. Alright, so that is fully disassembled. The sides of the shell, the handle, are held on with a single washer-headed screw on the back on both of them. You can take that off, and then it's really easy to paint the blaster if you really want to. I don't know that anyone makes a replacement grip, but if they did, it would be easy to do that. Okay, let's proceed to reassembly. So we're going to start by reassembling, well, obviously putting the rail back in and the jam door and all that, but then we're going to reassemble our barrel magazine plunger tube assembly. The barrel goes in, obviously O-ring to the back, hop-up tab forward, and it just goes in. Try to keep it as centered as possible because that will be necessary when we go to reinstall it. The plunger tube tab goes up and to the back, obviously, and it also just clips on. And that goes forward. We are then going to put the front barrel cap plate on as well. And then, hypothetically, it should all nicely slide in. tricky part is going to be getting the barrel. It has a tab that locks into these sockets on either side, and that is what fixes it in place, because the barrel is not supposed to move, but the magazine and the plunger tube both do. As you can see, they both will slide. First the plunger tube comes back, and then the whole magazine breech assembly comes back, and then it all gets pushed back forward together, kind of kaleidoscopes, or telescopes. Kaleidoscopes. Pull yourself together, man. Alright, now we get to the part that is probably the most difficult part, the part that gives people the most trouble, which is that slide lock. Which, as I said, is not entirely necessary, but it does make sure that you cycle the blaster fully. Another train! So I'm gonna... it goes in. Here is how the spring should be configured on it. So the torsion spring has those two prongs need to go on either side of that tab, and then when it gets installed, they go on either side of this screw post like this. The tab should be sticking up, that locking tab, and it should, whichever way you rotate it, it should return to that upward position. If it doesn't do that when you rotate it, then you've got the spring on wrong, or you've got it not aligned on something correctly. That is the most difficult part people tend to have a problem with, is that'll pop loose and then they can't figure out how it's supposed to go back in. It isn't actually necessary. You can just leave it out and the blaster will still function properly. It might just be a little more prone to jams or misprimes or what have you. Next, our trigger lock goes in. And the leaf spring obviously goes down. Fairly simple. Trigger then goes in over the top of it. At this point, I would put the lower slide in place and pull it back just a little bit. And now you're going to prime the blaster. As I mentioned before, you can in fact prime it, and you need to in order to install it because of how much pre-compression it gets. If you try to put the blaster together while the spring is not caught, it will be very difficult. Also, as you put this in, the part of the slide lock that attaches to that assembly needs to be put in. And it will all go into place. Pull your slide back just a little bit so you can get your two plates. The smaller one goes on top so that the two slopes line up. And then that just goes right in there. And finally, this part of the slide lock can get put into place. Then we can put it all forward again. You can just lift this up to disengage it and put it back down. Make extra sure that this is still in the right position, because when you're fiddling with all of that, it's not uncommon for that spring to get out of alignment, and then when you put it all back together, it will lock and it won't unlock, and it'll give you all sorts of problems. So you need to make sure that this is still springing to the upward position from either direction. We can then put the shell back on. And it should go together easily. If anything isn't nicely aligned, if anything is misaligned, the shell will not go on. There should not be any large gaps, there shouldn't be any bulges, it should all go together smoothly. Do not try to force it, you will just end up stripping out your screw posts. If things are not going back together correctly, then something on the inside is misaligned or not quite in the right position, a spring has sprung. Don't force it. You can crush your springs and damage them, you can cause all sorts of problems. So once that is in place, we're going to put in the screw that goes under the slide. That will be the first screw that we put in place. You can then put the slide on. And I'm going to put the unusual screws in first. So we've got the two that are in the base of the handle. Those are our long ones. And remember to always rotate counterclockwise a little bit until you feel it clunk into place. That is the thread aligning. And the screws should go in easily. You should not have to torque the screws a lot to get them to go back in. Because it's metal sliding on plastic, it should go smoothly. If you're having a lot of trouble putting it in, that means that the threads are not aligned properly and that you are cross-threading and you are chewing up the thread, and that is bad. If you do it too many times, eventually the thread will give out entirely and the screw will no longer have any purchase. I do have a video on how to repair stripped out screw posts. Basically just drill them out, fill them with epoxy putty, and drill a new hole once it sets. Remember, the one short screw goes up here in the rail, and then our two tiny countersunk screws go on either side of the shell in the slide. And then all of the rest of the screws are identical, so it doesn't matter which ones go where. Okay, now that it's back together, remember it is currently primed, so we are going to want to fire it. And then we can check all of the controls, make sure that the safety still works, still disengages, yep. Make sure that the partial slide lock engages, can't go forward, yep. Fully locked, now we can go, or make sure, yep, trigger is disengaged, go forward, it locks, we can't go back. Once it's all the way primed, we cannot pull the slide, but can we still release it? Yes, we can. Blaster still fires. And there you go. That is the full disassembly and reassembly of the Kronos. The survey for what blaster you'd like to see next will still be down in the description. I may not do them in the order that was most popular. Some of them I may not have. The most popular, the one that's been voted on the most currently is the Slingfire. I don't currently have a stock Slingfire, so I will be acquiring one of those so that I can do the Slingfire. But in the meantime, I will pick another one from the list that you guys are putting together. Feel free to add ones that aren't currently on the list. I will add them to the survey, and then people can vote on them. And yeah, hope this was helpful. Thank you guys for watching.